This video is on the Prelude, one of the poems in the Power and Conflict Poetry cluster for English Literature GCSE. As with some of the previous videos, there's some pictures here to prompt your understanding of the poem. So in the Prelude, it starts where he steals a little boat that's tied up by a willow tree, as suggested by this picture, and then he rows out across the lake until he sees this mountain that he describes as black and huge. And so these pictures just help us to remember the poem, essentially, when we've got 14 of the poems to remember. And the poem is set in the Lake District. Again, it's just another picture that kind of illustrates this idea of him on his boat. This isn't a willow tree, but this kind of little tree. And then as he rows out into the lake, he is overwhelmed by the power of nature and the sense of his surroundings. As with all the other videos, I won't be reading the poem to you. I will assume that you have a copy of the poem in front of you and that you have read it at least once, hopefully twice, although we will go over the kind of literal meaning of it. And here you can see some of the quotations that we're going to be discussing in more detail and some of the bits that you really might want to commit to memory, because when you're in the exam, you won't have the second poem in front of you. So obviously if the poem is Prelude, that will be printed, but if you choose to write about Prelude in relation to another poem, you will need to know these quotes off by heart. So if you wish to highlight these on your copy of your poem, stop the video now or pause the video so that you can copy these down. Let's look then at the key ideas in the poem in terms of the literal and metaphorical meaning, and also maybe a bit of the context. So as it says here, the poem centres on Wordsworth's childhood memory in the Lake District, which is northwest England, where he steals a boat and he rows it into the middle of a lake. The mountain by the lake looks much bigger than he realised. He hurries back to shore, and his view of nature is changed by his experience. You do not need to write that down. That is just the literal understanding of the poem. So why does he choose to write about this? Well, because the poem has a deeper metaphorical meaning. What Wordsworth really wants to write about is this idea of man, or human, versus nature, and the individual who seems insignificant in relation to the ultimate power of nature. Initially, he tries to control nature, but he can't. So that is really what moved him to write this poem. A little bit about Wordsworth. Both parents died when he was a teenager and he was brought up by relatives. He had a very unhappy upbringing and he spent a lot of time outdoors and felt very connected to nature. Like Blake, who wrote the poem London, Wordsworth was a romantic poet. He was writing during the Victorian era, where we know about the Industrial Revolution, due to A Christmas Carol, and he was really against this. He believed in the power and beauty of nature. And so in this sense, we can read the poem as a warning to society to resist the industrialisation of the countryside. Right? So if we're thinking about writers' ideas and this kind of metaphorical meaning, that's what he was trying to achieve by writing the poem. It's really important that you do note a couple of bits down from this slide. The metaphorical meaning and the context is really important. The poet's background, not so important. That's just to help your understanding. So let's look at the first section of the poem, because it's all in one verse really. So I've just divided it up to make it more manageable. He starts off by saying, "One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree." The key bits to pick out here are this first phrase, "led by her," in brackets. Now, her is nature, so we've got the personification of nature. Think about that idea of Mother Nature. Now, obviously, this experience happened to him. It's based on a real experience, so the poem is autobiographical, and then later on he's written the poem down. At the time, he probably didn't realise that he was being sort of led by nature, but in retrospect, he now realises that nature is in control here. Maybe almost as if it was his fate to have this experience. So in this sense, we realise that Wordsworth doesn't have the power or control that he thought he had. And the brackets help give us this idea that we know that he's thinking about it in retrospect. He finds a little boat, and the use of the adjective little is interesting here. We might say that it emphasises his innocence and his insignificance. Now we find out that he stole the boat. Okay, it wasn't his, and he says he unloosed the chain, and it was an act of stealth. So he's kind of being sly and sneaky. He thinks at the beginning of the poem that as a human, he is dominant and in control, and he feels that he is making these choices and decisions under his own motivation. And he describes then the kind of beautiful evening and the sparkling light. And he describes his rowing, and he says, "But now, like one who rows proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view." So again, we get this sense of he feels that he's in control. He fixed his view, and he's chosen his point, and he feels that these are all his decisions that he's making. But he soon realises that this isn't the case. Again, he comes across very arrogant and confident here. He's proud of his skill as a rower, and he rows in an unswerving line, a line that is not swerving, so therefore a straight line. Okay, so we've got this image of him very much in control of the little boat and confident in his ability. And again, this confidence is emphasised and echoed by the use of personal pronouns like I, because he is in control. Now, one term that I do want to introduce here is this idea of what's called parallelism. Parallel when two things run alongside each other. And we've got parallel images that run alongside each other. The first image is this one here that we're talking about, where he is rowing his boat. And there's a parallel image of him rowing his boat later on, although some things have changed, and that is deliberate, and we'll look at that when we get to it. You could also at this point use the word motif, because we've got a repeated image. So you could write about parallelism in the same way that you could write about motifs. So we have this motif of him rowing his boat and feeling very much confident and in control. Now he describes the boat, and he says she was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake. Elfin means elf-like, and a pinnace is a type of boat. That's less important, but this phrase, or this word elfin, this adjective, is really interesting here. It means small and delicate, but also like an elf. Okay, an elf is a mystical creature, so therefore this whole experience seems mystical and delicate. And his vocabulary at the beginning of the poem is very poetic and descriptive. We've already had words like glittering, for example, on the previous slide. And this creates a contrast later in the poem when he kind of doesn't see the mountain because he knows the mountain's already there, but sort of sees it for the first time in through different eyes, or realises the power of the mountain. And again, we see he's very much in control. I and my, just like we looked at on the previous slides, show his confidence and control. The way he is in control of the oars as he goes across the water. And then he sees on the horizon a huge peak, black and huge. Now, we've got this repetition of the word huge. This is not because the poet couldn't think of any other words to put. He's got a wide vocabulary. This repetition is deliberate. And it seems almost like he's stuttering here. He can't think of the words. A huge peak, black and huge. And we've got lots of commas here as well that are kind of breaking down this part of the poem. We've got some caesura here as well as the enjambement. And it all seems very sort of like staccato, like stops and starts. And this gives us a sense of how overwhelmed and intimidated he is by the mountain. We haven't got beautiful words like lustily and elfin and glittering now. We've got very powerful, strong words, huge, peak, black. They're all monosyllabic, like one-syllable words, which suggests that he is almost lost for words. He's speechless, and his language has become clumsy. He's lost his power that makes him human, his language. That's what separates us from other animals. And the mountain as well is also personified. It upreared its head, almost like a monster here. And again, this sense of it rearing over him gives a sense of its power and its dominance in comparison to his little boat. And so he panics, and it says, I struck and struck again. With trembling oars I turned. So we see him suddenly panicking and rowing away from the big mountain. Now this is where we get this parallel image. He's now not rowing in his unswerving line. He's not heading for a specific point. He's literally running away in panic. And we have this sense of a loss of confidence and a sense of chaos, which demonstrates his shift in mindset as he realizes that he is not as strong and powerful as he thought he was. And the mountain, or its kind of image, as well as towering up over him, seems, he says, to stride after him. It strode, a measured motion, like a living thing, strode after me. Now, if you stride along, it's describing how you walk. You're not rushing if you're striding. You've got a sense of purpose, and you're very confident. So now all those qualities to do with calm, confidence belong to the mountain rather than him. And it seems as if he's almost, I was going to say in a battle, but there's no battle here because he just turns and runs away. But nature is out to get him. And nature is finding this sort of easy intimidation of man. It's literally like a walk in the park for this mountain to stride after him. And then he says he stole his way back to the covert of the willow tree. So we come right back to the beginning. We've got a cyclical structure here, and he comes back to the willow tree and puts the boat back in her mooring place, like where it was originally moored. Now, interestingly, we've got, as well as this parallel image of the rowing boat, or the motif, if you would rather use that terminology of the rowing boat, we've got this use of the word stole, which reminds us of the fact that this was an act of stealth. He originally steals the boat and is very much in control, but now he steals his way. To steal your way means to sort of sneak away, and he's trying to do it secretively. And this is a sign of his weakness. He doesn't want to be seen or heard, or he doesn't want to upset the balance. Pause here and make sure you've got all these ideas down. And then once he comes back to the willow tree, this kind of cyclical structure, he then talks about the effect of it. He goes homeward through the meadows. He's in a serious mood. And he broods on this for many days, and his brain's working hard trying to understand it. But he's sort of lost his way a little bit. He's dim and undetermined. So he's lost his focus. And if we compare that back to that unswerving line that he had at the beginning, we can see how he's lost his way. And now nothing seems to make sense anymore. No familiar shapes remained. And he then says at the end of the poem, huge and mighty forms, that do not live like living men, so that are not humans, i.e. nature and the mountain, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. So we can see that this experience is weighing heavily. It's creating nightmares for him, and it's all he can think about. It's occupying his mind. So what we get here is a sense of the fear that Wordsworth is experiencing, and the menacing quality of nature. Nature is powerful. It's beyond the realm of understanding, and it's becoming a nightmare to him. Nature is uncontrolled, but also uncontrollable. He can't control his thoughts anymore, and the sort of sense of the power of nature is what occupies his mind. So that's it really in terms of the poem. Now we'll look at some of the other key ideas in terms of structure as well. But really, there's quite a bit, if I just flick back to this slide, in terms of key quotations that you can learn. I want to start off then when we're looking at structure actually by looking at form rather than structure. Okay, and this is the form is the type. Okay, so we study the form of a play within spectacles, the form of a novel with A Christmas Carol, and we study various forms of poetry. And poetry can then be broken down into more kind of different subcategories, different forms. So we had a ballad, for example, not a ballad, sorry, a sonnet with Ozymandias as a particular form. And now we've got what's called the form of an epic poem. Epic poems were a very popular structure and form historically, and they take a kind of narrative style. They tell a story. And in an epic poem, we also have this heroic protagonist, this main character. And during the story, the narrative of the epic poem, this heroic protagonist, this main character, goes on a journey or an adventure. And they generally at some point have some kind of battle as well. They often have a very mystical element or sort of legend type element as well. And in this sense, the journey that the protagonist goes on, which is Wordsworth as a child, creates a sense of awe towards nature. Now again, the epic poems always have this kind of sense of awe, this sense of how amazing and awesome and overwhelmed we are by someone's journey. But in this sense, all this is directed towards nature rather than to this amazing hero, which Wordsworth definitely isn't in this poem. He runs away, remember, at the end. So if Wordsworth isn't the hero, well, who is the hero? And in this poem, the hero is nature, the personification of nature, not the speaker. Okay, not Wordsworth. And actually it's the opposite of that, because Wordsworth realizes that he is completely insignificant and it's nature that is powerful, as opposed to in other epic poems where the speaker, the hero, or the main character is the one who would seem super powerful by the end. And so in this sense, the journey or the adventure that Wordsworth goes on is one of spiritual growth. He doesn't become powerful, he doesn't win any wars, but he does learn a lot. And he becomes aware of this battle between man and nature that he probably wasn't even aware of before. And nature is definitely what triumphs in the end. So, unlike some of the other poems, talking about the form of this poem as an epic poem is really, really important. But let's have a look at the structure as well. The poem is set out in a single verse or a single stanza. What could we say about the effect of that? Well, we could say it reflects Wordsworth's own feeling of feeling overwhelmed. He has to, as we read through the poem, this one verse seems quite overwhelming, just as Wordsworth's experience of nature overwhelmed him. The other thing we can say about the structure is it's cyclical. It begins and it ends in the same place, by the willow tree where he returns the boat. And so the effect here is that it's reinforcing this idea of it not being a physical journey, but an internal psychological journey, one of realization. And the other thing we might want to pick out as well is this idea of enjambment. Okay, so remember that's where the full stop isn't at the end of the line. The sentence runs on into the next line. And in prose, in a story, that wouldn't be a problem, because obviously all the lines just carry on and you just finish the line according to the layout of the book. Whereas in poetry, this is a deliberate decision by the poet. And so this use of enjambment creates a lack of control in terms of the effect, because the lines just sort of carry on, or the sentences carry on into the next line. So the enjambement reflects how Wordsworth feels, and it also makes it seem like a sort of stream of consciousness, as if it's all just pouring out of him. And so we get the sense of this poem being what we might want to describe as cerebral. It's all in his head. It's internal, and it's very much to do with his thoughts or his perception of the world. So there's quite a few key points that you can write about there in terms of structure and form. Pause the video, make sure you've got those notes down. So what could we say about the writer's ideas? Well, maybe he wants to criticise humanity's own sense of self-importance. And people often are egocentric. That means we put ourselves at the centre of everything. Ego being, our kind of ourselves, centricity in the centre. So maybe he's kind of criticising humanity's view of itself. Maybe he wants to teach us about the power and influence of nature, and he wants to teach us to respect nature more. And again, remember, this was written during the Industrial Revolution, where he felt that maybe people were not respecting nature enough and maybe undermining its power and influence. So he's warning society about the danger and the damage that Industrial Revolution could be having, which is very pertinent now when we look back and realise the damage that we did do to nature in terms of the damage to the climate, and how now we're trying to make sure that other countries who haven't gone through that sort of revolution in the same way don't damage our earth in the same way that we did. We want them to learn from our mistakes. But obviously during the Industrial Revolution, the big change was having an impact on nature and the countryside. Fields were being turned into factories, cities were expanding, woods were being chopped down to build roads and canals and all sorts of things. So we can see how the time of his writing, the context, writing during the Industrial Revolution, has really influenced what he's chosen to write about. Again, he wants to reveal the importance of nature, the importance of the outdoors. We know he enjoyed that experience himself, and celebrating rural life at a time when maybe people were turning their back on this kind of rural life, and we had this massive influx of people moving to the city. So some really, really important ideas there about how Wordsworth's ideas and why he was writing are actually born out of the time in which he was writing and his own beliefs. Pause the video here to make sure you've got all of this down. So in this sense then, the themes are quite straightforward. It's about the power of nature, it's about man versus nature or humanity versus nature, but this is also a poem about an individual's experience, and that means it gives us lots of scope for linking and comparing to other poems. Just like in Kamikaze, the power of nature brings the man back, and so there's a key link there in terms of nature and its effect on the individual. Ozymandias is also about the power of nature, and like Wordsworth, the king Ozymandias has this kind of misplaced confidence in himself, I would say, and Wordsworth is the same. He has this misplaced confidence in himself. However, Wordsworth does realise his arrogance and his mistakes, whereas Ozymandias doesn't. We might also want to compare it to Storm on the Island in terms of power of nature, and then also compare it as well as to Ozymandias, maybe to poems like Bayonet Charge, where we see the individual's lack of power or control. We might say the same about London, where it's looking at the lack of power or control of the individual. So there's lots of other options as well as the ones that I've mentioned there. If you need to note any of that down, make sure you do that now. On this slide then, you've got your prompts, and this is a good revision tool. So using that list of prompts there, what can you remember about the poem? And again, in terms of your quotations, you've got 9 quotations there, but they're generally all quite short. You need to learn those so that you can write about the poem Prelude, and you need to be able to use those quotations to say a lot about a little, to really go into detail about not only the language and the terminology, but also about the writer's ideas and the effect and what they tell us about context. And then again, as part of your revision, there's a series of questions there. So you might want to pause the video there, or take a screenshot, or take a picture on your phone, and then have a go at answering those questions. First time you do it, you might do it with your notes, and the second time you might try and answer those questions completely independently, without your notes at all. And then finally, there's a reminder of some of the strategies that you can use to help you to revise. Remember, watching the videos and understanding the poems is not enough. You've got to use these strategies to help you consolidate and secure your knowledge and practice getting it out of your head, as well as watching these videos to put all the information in. I hope you found this video useful. Do make sure that you have got all your notes and they all make sense to you, rather than just blindly copying everything down. Thanks.